So at the time, you actually were director of National Economic Council, and you helped put together a plan with Lloyd Bentsen at Treasury, but President Clinton really pushed it through. Give us a sense of how bad the problems were you were facing then, what caused you to do what you did in the '93 Act.
David, we met with the president-elect, governor of Arkansas, in Little Rock after the election, the economic team, the income economic team, and we talked to him about what kind of an economic strategy he should have. And he said, after listening to all this, our deficit is a threshold issue. And if we want to do everything else, we've got to do that because we have to get our fiscal house in order. And that was really our focus. Now, we did it in the same time we did public investment, but the pressures, I think, were very substantial. There was a lot of concern in the business community, there was a lot of concern in the markets, and there was a real public political environment, which unfortunately we don't have today, to address the, so he not only had the substance of it, which is President Clinton's view that this was the threshold issue. We also have a political environment in which it was doable.
If we can try to tease those two things out, how much of it was the market reaction, what you were seeing basically? We have the famous incident supposedly where Jim Carville said, I want to come back to the bond market.
Well, that was James said that he wanted to come, well, because what happened there was we were having a debate within the administration. Should we focus on fiscal matters or should we focus on public investment? We ended up doing both, but with a program, the '93 deficit reduction program, that was very heavily focused on deficit reduction. And that's when James said he wanted, because we argued, and I think rightly argued, and it turned out to be correct, that markets would react very favorably if we were serious, and also that the Federal Reserve would react very favorably. So James, in response to all that, said he would like to come back in his next life as the bond market.
So that is a somewhat market-oriented approach. I mean, you'd come out of Goldman Sachs, you knew the markets terribly well. You took that sort of approach to the whole question. How much of that drove what it was? Was it really just almost dollars and cents in what was going on in the markets?
Well, it was more than just the markets, and I think this is something unfortunately that hasn't been focused on. But it was the markets, David. And when we got serious about deficit reduction, it was very favorable for the markets, and also Greenspan reacted very well in terms of maintaining a relatively livable, maybe the wrong word, was a practical speaking, a Fed funds rate that was consistent with growth. But it went way beyond that. We wanted to have the resilience. After all, if you have an economic or national security emergency of some sort, you want to be able to deal with it without creating fiscal havoc. And another thing, when I was at Goldman Sachs, and Steve Friedman and I were the co-CEOs of Goldman Sachs, in '91 and in '92, one thing that I had the impression of was that business was very concerned about our fiscal position, not only because of the fiscal position per se, but also because it gave them the feeling government was incapable of dealing with our problems. So business confidence, I think, was a very important factor. And once we acted, I think it had a really positive effect on business confidence.
Well, give me a sense of what that means as a practical matter. Does that translate into investment or lack of investment?
Yeah,
practically?
That's exactly what it does. Well, investment, plans in terms of expansion, and generally just. John Maynard Keynes famously referred to animal spirits in his famous letter to President Roosevelt. And animal spirits make confidence makes a very big difference. And yeah, it does in terms of hiring plans, expansion plans, investment. And that absolutely is what happened.
Talk about the politics of it. You said that then governor, about to be President Clinton, came in and said the threshold issue of the deficit. It's hard to imagine right now an incoming president saying the same thing. But give me a sense of what was going on politically in the country that obviously President Clinton was reflecting to some extent what he thought the people felt.
Yeah, I think there was a feeling, there was a broad public concern about our fiscal position. And then Paul Tsongas ran for president on a fiscal, he unfortunately died, as you know, in that process, but on a fiscal discipline plank, if you want to call it that, or program, let's say, and that attracted a lot of favorable attention. Then Ross Perot came along, and he ran also on a fiscal discipline theory, and he got about 19% of the vote, if I remember correctly. President Clinton believed it to begin with, but then you had the politics, I guess you'd call converge around this point of view, as you saw Tsongas and then, as I said, Perot, and President Clinton made that central to his economic program. But you know, David, he always combined it with vigorous public investment. Now, once we got there, what we found was that the prospects that the outgoing Bush OMB was providing had gotten much worse. And so it forced us to cut back on what we would have done on public investment and increase what we did on deficit reduction.
So when you decided to address this, I should say the president decided.
The president absolutely decided. He was terrific, David. He really was steeped in this. So while all of us gathered together, we really were gathering with somebody who already was really very heavily informed on this. By this, I mean on economic policy, ramifications of various measures one might take.
When one goes back and looks at the package, it looks like there was both tax increases as well as spending cuts.
Correct.
Was that the theory from the beginning? We have to do it both ways at the same time?
The theory, well, the theory was we would do 50-50, and we did do 50-50. We're discussing then and not now, but if you looked at now, I think unfortunately we face a very different empirical situation. But in those days, that's exactly was our theory, and that's what we did.
We're going to come back and talk about it now, but before that, give us a sense of the effects once you got this through. By the way, it was a near-run thing politically, as I recall, in the Congress.
We won. We had by one vote, if I remember correctly, in the House of Representatives, and it was a tie, I guess, in the Senate, and Gore cast a deciding vote in our favor, obviously. But it was a very close thing, and I remember being in the Oval Office the night of the vote. You know, there's that little room that is adjacent to the Oval Office. It's the president's room. And we were all sitting there watching a television as people voted. And it was a very near thing and a real nail-biter.
How did the results of it through the rest of the Clinton term, if we can take it through there, compare with what you expected? When you first got it through, if you'd written down and said, this is what I expect.
That's a good
and
question.
And you compare with what actually happened, how did they compare?
You know, David, that's a good question. I think one thing that I saw, and I think was right, was that our fiscal situation, for the reasons I already discussed, was having a real adverse effect on business confidence. And I thought if we did this, there was a reasonable chance that could affect that. But I think the effect of it was much greater than I thought it would be. President Clinton went through 8 years in which the business community felt that he related to the issues that they faced. They didn't always agree with them, or he didn't always agree with them. But I think they really felt that he related to their issues. And I think this played a major role in that. I thought something like that would happen. At least that would have been my expectation. But I think it happened to a greater degree than I thought. The markets reacted very well, as you may remember, in terms of interest rates.
One big difference between then and now is we were very concerned at the time, I remember this personally, with Japan. The rise of Japan as an economic power, that they basically had a better mousetrap than we did, and they'd take us over. How important was that in helping drive this through to say, look, we've got to actually catch up with Japan?
As you correctly say, David, Japan was viewed as a Goliath. And I can remember this so well when I was at Goldman Sachs, because we were very much focused on where should our business go, where should we focus, and we very much focused on Japan for the very reason you just said. And I think that was part of it. I think there was a feeling of a real competitive urgency, if you will, imperative, a real competitive imperative with respect to Japan. But it was more than that, David. I think there was just a general recognition, which we don't have today, in the country, that unsound fiscal conditions were very dangerous, which I think they are, very dangerous economically. And people sort of connected the dots, and there was broad-based support for fiscal discipline. And that was a political reality within the context of which President Clinton acted, and then eventually, and Congress came along, although, as you said, by a very, very narrow margin.
You mentioned Chairman Greenspan, Alan Greenspan at the time. What role did he play and the Fed play throughout this entire process?
Well, I will tell you what it was. It's not been written this way sometimes, but Alan Greenspan came down to Little Rock. He conferred with the President-elect Clinton, and I think his advice was very sound. On the other hand, there was never, although it was alleged in some places that there was, never a deal, and I've asked both President Clinton and Alan Greenspan about this, there was never a deal between the two of them pursuant to which if you, President Clinton, will reduce the deficit, I'll keep interest rates low. That never occurred. But what did occur was the advice that Alan Greenspan gave to President Clinton and all of us, because we had a very good relationship about what at least he thought, and then we would deal with it as we saw fit. One of the key elements, as I understand it, economists tell us, of economic growth is productivity. Was there an effect, in your opinion, on productivity? What was the effect? How large was it? There was a substantial effect on productivity, and it's sort of interesting, at least in my opinion, David, because this was also, as you may remember, the 90s was the time that the technology development took off, but even more important, maybe the application of technology took off. But it happened here and it didn't happen in Europe to nearly the same degree. So the question is why, and I'll tell you what I think. I think the administration made and President Clinton made an enormous difference in this respect, because I think what happened was what you were getting at before. I think there was an atmosphere of confidence It doesn't mean that, as I said before, so I'm repeating myself, it didn't mean that business agreed with everything we did, because they didn't. But fundamentally, they believed that this was a sound administration, and I think that had an enormous impact on investment and therefore on productivity. So we had a productivity boost from both the technology development and application, which Europe, which had a different sort of political environment and a different sense of confidence, or in their case, lack thereof, than we did.
So, Bob, we've been talking about what happened in '93 when you were there in the White House. Now let's bring it forward to today, because there's a lot of talk about the debt and deficit, which is frankly a lot larger, both in nominal dollars and in comparative dollars, than it was back then. Let's talk about what you learned in '93, what you did in '93 that could conceivably be applied to 2024.
It's also a lot bigger, David, and this is the really important thing, as a percentage of GDP, the percentage of our economy. And that, I think, is the critical point. I think that the risks that we identified then, the multiple risks, are the same as they are today. I think that the risks are even greater today because our debt-GDP ratio is CBO estimates at about 100% right now. It's the highest in the history of the country, except for 1946 and 47, when we were coming back out of World War II. I think the risks are enormous, and some of them are materializing already, like higher interest rates and effect on inflation, in part, not in full. And others haven't materialized yet, but I think they're out there, and sooner or later will materialize if we don't correct our fiscal trajectory.
You talked about some of the market indicators and even forces that you saw in '93 that sort of pointed you in a direction, pointed President Clinton in the direction of really making the deficit a threshold issue. Are we seeing those indicators of the forces today in the markets?
I think that we are seeing the effects, but it's unfortunately, from a political point of view, David, I don't think they're getting connected in a meaningful way, with deficit reduction. Sure, interest. I mean, the 10-year was about, I think, 1.5%, say, 2 years ago, and now it's about 4.5%. Now, that's a lot of factors that go into that, but I think part of it is our fiscal situation and the effect that's had on inflation. I think it's been an aggravator of, or, if you will, an effect on inflation. And I think there's a general concern about the imbalance between supply and demand for savings and the excess demand that's created by our deficits. But it's not, unfortunately, from a political point of view, I don't think the dots are being connected the way they were back in 92-3 when we acted. Well, 93 we acted, but 92 when President Clinton was putting his plans together. There's
a lot of talk these days when we talk about the Fed about the neutral rate and a debate about whether is the neutral rate higher. And I guess my question is, does the deficit and the debt normally, all the things being equal, drive the neutral rate higher?
I think over time. But I think you can also have a long period of time, and we had a long period of time, David, actually a long, long period of time, during which all of this was having little effect. And then all of a sudden, the 10-year went, as I said a moment ago, from roughly 1.5 to roughly 4.5. And I've been around markets and these policies for 5 decades now. And there certainly are periods when you can have a long time when reality is out of, or what's happening is out of sync with reality. But that doesn't go on forever, and when it corrects, it can correct savagely. A good example was the sovereign eurozone crisis. For years, the Greek bonds traded, roughly speaking, parity with give or take, with German bonds, and then all of a sudden it exploded. And I think it's a good example of how what isn't sensible ultimately doesn't continue.
There's the politics of it, which I want to talk about. Before that, let's talk about the approach taken to it. Let's talk about, for example, the Biden administration. We can talk about the Trump administration if you want. Sure. But the Biden administration. When you were there back in the 90s, you came from Goldman Sachs. You had other people there who knew the markets pretty well. There was a healthy dose of how are the markets reacting to this? What does that do for us? Do we still have that, or is it more ideologically driven? Because some people think we've sort of shifted the orientation, particularly the Democratic Party, more toward protectionism, more toward populism.
Well, you've asked multiple questions, so I'll give you my view. I've given a lot of thought to this, and I know the people there pretty well. If you look at the proposals, but I want to respond to something you said that's a little different. Well, I'll get to that in a second. If you look at the proposals, the major policy proposals that President Biden made, they were all paid for in the proposals. Now, ultimately, they had to go through Congress, and when they went through Congress, they came out, some of them paid for and some of them not. I think he's actually pretty good on this. I think there are other issues where I might have a different view than he does, or maybe I would have an altered view rather than a different view. But I think on fiscal stuff, actually, he's got a pretty good sense of it. I think on the proposals, they had 3 major bills, IRA, CHIPS, and infrastructure. And in the original proposal, and then of course before that, Build Back Better. And all of those, if you look at this is correct, because I looked at them, in all of those, the proposals were fully paid for. They had to go through Congress, and in Congress, in some cases, they lost the pay-fors. You mentioned, I've forgotten how you put it now before, but did you say populism or progressive?
Populism, yeah.
Yeah, populism. If you look at what is being referred to as industrial policy, and they refer to it as industrial policy, it's their label,
yes.
but it's not picking winners and losers. Now, it may be in the minds of some of those people, but if you look at those proposals, and I've talked to their people about this a lot, I think they actually make a lot of sense on a purely economic basis. They're externalities. They basically dealt with with insecurities in our system, in our economic system, with respect to our economic security, our economic functioning, our geopolitical or national security functioning, that markets were not going to meet and had to be met by government. So that, I think, is not industrial policy in the traditional sense of let's pick winners and losers. It was let's fill holes that the private sector simply isn't filling, and those are holes of economic and national security.
So from your perspective, the overall approach you don't take much issue with.
No, I really
So how do we
don't.
end up with where we are, where we have increasing deficits and increasing debt?
Oh, well, wait a minute. What I talked about was the proposals he made.
Yes.
No, I think we're in a terrible place, David, because unfortunately, once you get to legislating, there isn't the will. There's a lot of talk, but the talk is always divided politically between the Republicans who refuse to raise taxes and the Democrats who won't deal with entitlements. Now, I think there is a reality to this, and that is I do think when we eventually get to doing this, or if we were to do it after the next election, which the good Lord would hope we will, but I wouldn't bet on it, about 60% or something of the increase in the debt from 2000 to 2022 was because of the tax cuts. So if it hadn't been for that, the debt, instead of being 100% GDP, would be about 60%. Another way to look at it is exactly what I just said, which is what percentage of debt, what percent would the debt be of GDP if we had the two tax cuts? And you come out to about the same number, around 63%, something like that. So I think in very large measure, what happened is we had two very big tax cuts, neither of which were paid for. So we decided not to pay for what we were spending, and that's how we got where we are. But looking forward, we're going to have to deal with both spending and taxes. So I think for the reasons I just said, when you get realistic about it, I think you're going to have to be largely on the tax side.
On the tax cuts, the theory of that was to increase productivity, increase growth. Can we grow our way out of the problem?
No, but let's go back one step. When the Trump tax cuts were enacted, one of the major investment banks put out a piece saying that on a 10-year basis, they thought that the tax cuts had zero effect on investment and productivity and growth. Now, that's the tax cuts in terms of their impact. On the other hand, what it did do was contribute greatly to our deficits.
When it comes to really garnering support.
But can we grow our way out? Look, if we could put in place a serious, inclusive growth strategy and increase our rate of growth, that would certainly help because that goes debt over GDP. So that would help. But I still think we're going to have to deal with our expending, but even mostly with our taxes.
If we could put together a plan, as you look at the two likely candidates right now, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, is either one putting forward a comprehensive growth plan?
No, but I think the answer, I think, is no. But I do think if you look at what President Biden has done, as I said a few moments ago, I actually think he's sort of pretty much on the right track. I think if you look at the major programs, these, I believe, are externalities they were dealing with. That is to say, areas where the economy needed the intervention of government to deal with what the markets were not. But I would say that neither one is at the present time put forward a program. But if you extrapolate what President Biden has done, looking forward, conceptually, I at least be pretty comfortable with it, subject to the caveat that we need to focus on the issues that we have been unable to politically. But that, of course, gets you back to the politics. Trump is a different matter. I mean, Trump is talking about huge tax cuts, and that will just exacerbate our problem. I don't think it's going to have any effect at all on growth, just like other tax cuts did. I think there are a lot of other problems, by the way, around the Trump presidency that we could run into. The rule of law is fundamental to our economy. He's talking about weaponizing the Justice Department and the FBI. Look, the fundamental of any democracy is the peaceful transfer of power. He's denying the legitimacy of the 2020 election still. So I think there are a lot of problems economically if he gets elected.
when we talked about 1993, we talked about Japan and the perceived threat of Japan, challenge of Japan. In the business community more broadly, can China play that role today? Where is China? Is it something that we need to focus on? Is it something that might cause the American people to say, you know, we better address this or else we're going to be in trouble with China?
I think people do say that to some extent. So that maybe, but it's not in the same way, David. I mean, Japan was a palpable, in a lot of people's minds, a palpable and ever-present risk at the time. I don't think China plays quite that role. Also, China, I wouldn't profess expertise with respect to China, but I know a little bit about it. I think they've got some really serious problems. I think they're much more, it's not just a question of the way they reacted to COVID or something. I think there's some really systemic problems. There was a terrific article, Foreign Affairs by Adam Posen, a few months ago, I guess, about what I would call the systemic issues that they face. I think they're very serious.